There exists within each of us a silent architecture of habit and desire that shapes our days more profoundly than we dare to acknowledge. Most people move through life believing they understand their struggles with temptation and compulsion, yet they see only the surface ripples, while vast currents move beneath. The morning coffee that becomes 5 cups, the quick glance at the phone that becomes hours lost in digital fog, the promise to stop that becomes another broken vow by nightfall. These are not mere weaknesses or failures of character. They are symptoms of something far deeper, something that speaks in a language we have forgotten how to hear. Carl Jung understood what modern psychology often misses. He saw that addiction extends far beyond the obvious substances and behaviors that society labels as dangerous. Every person carries within them a complex web of dependencies, not just on alcohol or nicotine or gambling, but on patterns of thought, on ways of avoiding discomfort, on stories we tell ourselves about who we are and what we deserve. The executive who cannot stop working, drowning in emails at midnight, is no different from the person reaching for another drink. The parent scrolling endlessly through social media while their children play nearby shares. The same fundamental struggle as someone battling substance dependency. We are all, in our own ways, running from something we cannot name. The battlefield exists not in the external world, but in the inner landscape of the psyche. Here, in the quiet moments when we are alone with ourselves, the real war unfolds. On one side stands what we consciously want, the person we tell ourselves we are becoming, the goals we set, and the promises we make. On the other side lurks something older, deeper, more primal. It knows our weaknesses because it is part of us. It knows exactly when we are most vulnerable, exactly what whisper will make us surrender. This is not some foreign invader, but a part of our own soul crying out in the only language it knows. Jung recognized this internal conflict, not as a battle between good and evil, but as a conversation we are refusing to have with ourselves. When someone lights that cigarette they swore they would never touch again, they are not simply giving in to a chemical craving. They are responding to a call from the depths of their being, a part of themselves that feels unheard, unseen, unloved. The addiction is merely the messenger, carrying a letter we are too afraid to read. It tells us about the loneliness we cannot admit, the fear we cannot face, the dreams we have abandoned, the parts of ourselves we have locked away in the darkness, hoping they would disappear. Consider the moment before surrender, that instant when the resolve crumbles and the old pattern reasserts itself. Time seems to slow down. There is a negotiation happening, rapid and often unconscious. The rational mind presents its arguments about health, about promises made, about consequences tomorrow. But something else speaks louder, not in words, but in feelings, in a deep bodily knowledge that this thing, this behavior, this substance will provide what nothing else can. Not happiness exactly, but relief. Not joy, but absence of pain. Not connection, but escape from the terrible burden of being present with ourselves. This is what Jung meant when he wrote that people will do anything to avoid facing their own souls. The soul does not speak in the language of logic or morality. It speaks in symbols, in dreams, in compulsions, in the things that call to us in our weakest moments. When we refuse to listen to its gentle whispers, it begins to shout. When we ignore the shouts, it takes control of our hands, our choices, our lives. The addiction becomes the shadow running the show, while the conscious self watches helplessly from the wings. The great tragedy is that most approaches to breaking addiction focus entirely on strengthening the conscious will. Just say no, be stronger, have more discipline, count the days clean, make yourself accountable. These methods treat the symptom while ignoring the disease. They assume that if we can just be good enough, strong enough, disciplined enough, we can overcome. But this is like trying to hold back the ocean with our bare hands. The unconscious forces that drive addiction are vast and ancient. They have roots that reach back to our earliest experiences, to wounds we may not even remember, to needs that were never met, to parts of ourselves that were never welcomed into the light. Every time someone relapses after days or weeks or months of white-knuckling their way through sobriety, they experience not just the return of the behavior, but a crushing sense of personal failure. They believe they are weak, that they lack character, that they are fundamentally broken. But Jung would say they are not broken at all. They are simply fighting the wrong battle with the wrong weapons. You cannot defeat a part of yourself. You can only integrate it, understand it, and transform it into something that serves rather than enslaves. The fear that keeps us from looking deeper is entirely understandable. Who wants to excavate their own pain? Who wants to sit with the uncomfortable truths about what they are really seeking in their moments of weakness? It feels easier to keep running, to keep numbing, to keep the shadow at bay for just one more day. But this running is exhausting. It takes enormous energy to maintain the walls between ourselves and our own truth. Eventually, everyone grows tired. The walls crack. The shadow seeps through. And we find ourselves back at the beginning, reaching for the thing we swore we would never touch again. Yet in this seemingly endless cycle lies the seed of transformation. Every return to the old pattern is an opportunity to ask a different question. Instead of, why am I so weak? We might ask, what is this trying to tell me? Instead of, how can I stop? We might wonder, what am I really looking for? This shift in perspective changes everything. It moves us from a position of war to one of curiosity. It opens the door to a conversation with parts of ourselves we have been too afraid to acknowledge. And in that conversation, in that willingness to listen to what the addiction is trying to say, lies the beginning of genuine freedom. The moment you stop seeing your cravings as enemies to be conquered and begin recognizing them as messengers carrying important information, everything shifts. This is not a small adjustment in thinking, but a complete revolution in how you relate to your own mind. Most people spend decades trying to silence these messengers, to lock them out, to pretend they do not exist. They build elaborate fortresses of routine and restriction, hoping to keep the unwanted feelings at bay. But the messages keep coming, growing louder and more insistent with each attempt at suppression. Think about the last time you felt that familiar pull toward something you knew would ultimately leave you feeling worse. Perhaps it was late at night when the world had gone quiet and you were left alone with thoughts you did not want to think. Perhaps it was in the middle of a crowded room where you felt invisible despite being surrounded by people. The craving arrived not as a random neural firing, but as a response to something specific, something your conscious mind was trying desperately not to acknowledge. Maybe it was the weight of inadequacy, the fear of being exposed as a fraud, the loneliness that no amount of social interaction seems to cure. The craving knows exactly what you are feeling, even when you do not. Jung called this hidden aspect of ourselves the shadow, and understanding its nature is essential to comprehending why addiction has such power over us. The shadow is not some mystical concept, but a psychological reality as concrete as any physical organ. It consists of everything we have pushed away from conscious awareness because it was too painful, too shameful, too inconsistent with who we believe ourselves to be. Every time a child is told that anger is bad, a piece of their natural aggression goes into the shadow. Every time someone learns that their sensitivity makes them weak, their capacity for deep feeling retreats into darkness. Every time we choose safety over authenticity, another part of ourselves is exiled to this hidden realm. The shadow does not simply disappear because we refuse to look at it. It grows stronger in the darkness, fed by our denial and fear. It begins to operate independently, making choices we would never consciously make, driving behaviors that seem foreign to our waking self. When someone says they do not know why they keep returning to destructive patterns, they are telling the truth. The conscious mind genuinely does not understand because the behavior is being directed by parts of the psyche that have been cut off from awareness. The shadow has its own agenda, its own needs, its own ways of seeking what it requires for survival. Addiction becomes the shadow's perfect disguise, a socially understandable way for these exiled parts to get their needs met without having to reveal themselves fully. The workaholic who cannot stop checking emails is not just dedicated to their job. They are running from something, perhaps a feeling of worthlessness that only productivity can temporarily silence. The person who cannot put down their phone is not simply entertained by social media. They are avoiding the terror of being alone with themselves, of sitting in silence with all the thoughts and feelings they have been scrolling past for years. The addiction provides perfect cover for the shadow to operate, while the conscious self maintains plausible deniability. Our culture's approach to these struggles reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of human psychology. We are told to be strong, to have willpower, to just push through. We are given strategies for resistance, techniques for distraction, methods for maintaining control. But control is precisely the problem. The more we try to control the shadow, the more it controls us. This is the paradox that drives people to despair. The harder they fight, the stronger the addiction becomes. The more energy they put into resistance, the more exhausted they become, until eventually they have nothing left and the old pattern reasserts itself with even greater force than before. Jung understood that the shadow cannot be defeated through force, because it is not an enemy, but a part of ourselves that has been wounded and abandoned. Imagine a child locked in a dark basement, forgotten and alone, growing increasingly desperate to be heard. At first, they might knock gently on the door. When no one comes, they knock louder. Eventually, they begin pounding with their fists, screaming, throwing themselves against the barrier with all their might. This is what happens with our shadow material. The more we ignore it, the more violent its attempts at communication become. Addiction is often the shadow's last resort, its most desperate attempt to make us pay attention to what we have been refusing to see. The transformation begins not with fighting, but with listening. When the craving arises, instead of immediately moving to suppress it or satisfy it, there is another option. You can pause and observe. You can notice where it lives in your body, how it feels, what thoughts accompany it. You can treat it with curiosity rather than judgment. This simple act of observation creates a space between you and the craving, a gap where choice becomes possible. You are no longer identified with the urge, but witnessing it. You are not the craving, but the awareness that perceives the craving. This shift from identification to observation is profound. It means you are no longer at war with yourself. You are not trying to destroy a part of your own psyche, but to understand it. When you ask the craving what it wants, really wants, beneath the surface desire for the substance or behavior, you might be surprised by the answer. Perhaps it wants comfort in a world that feels harsh and unforgiving. Perhaps it wants excitement in a life that has become predictable and gray. Perhaps it wants numbness, because feeling everything fully seems like it would be unbearable. These are not unreasonable desires. They are human needs seeking fulfillment in the only way the shadow knows how. The practice of observation without judgment is difficult because we have been trained our entire lives to evaluate, categorize, and judge our inner experiences. Good thoughts, bad thoughts, acceptable feelings, unacceptable feelings, worthy desires, shameful desires. But the shadow does not respond to moral categories. It exists before and beneath such distinctions. When we can observe our cravings with the same neutral curiosity we might bring to watching clouds pass across the sky, something shifts. The craving loses its charge, its urgency, its power to compel. It becomes simply another experience arising in consciousness, no different from any other. As this practice deepens, you begin to notice patterns you had never seen before. The craving does not arise randomly, but in response to specific triggers, certain emotional states, particular times of day or situations. You start to see the craving not as a personal failing, but as a consistent response to consistent stimuli. This is valuable information. It tells you where your wounds are, where your unmet needs live, where your shadow is most active. With this knowledge, you can begin to address the root causes rather than simply managing symptoms. You can start to give yourself what you actually need rather than what the addiction promises, but never truly delivers. Recognition arrives slowly, like dawn breaking over a landscape you thought you knew, but had only seen in darkness. The patterns that have governed your life for years, perhaps decades, begin to reveal themselves not as random impulses, but as carefully orchestrated rituals with their own logic and meaning. Every addiction follows a script as precise as any theatrical performance, with its opening acts of triggers and tensions, its rising action of internal negotiation, its climax of surrender, and its denouement of regret and renewed promises. Understanding this script, reading it like an ancient text that contains hidden wisdom, becomes the key to transformation. Consider how ritualistic addictive behavior truly is. The person who drinks follows the same sequence each time, perhaps stopping at the same store, buying the same brand, sitting in the same chair, using the same glass. The one who loses themselves in digital distraction opens the same apps in the same order, scrolls through the same types of content, loses the same hours in the same numbing haze. These are not random acts, but ceremonies. And like all ceremonies, they serve a purpose beyond their surface appearance. They create a container for experience, a familiar structure in a chaotic world, a known pathway through unknown emotional territory. The ritual begins long before the actual behavior. It starts with a feeling, often so subtle it passes beneath conscious awareness. A tightness in the chest, a hollowness in the stomach, a restlessness in the limbs. The body knows before the mind that something is needed, that some equilibrium has been disturbed. Then comes the thought, appearing as if from nowhere. Just one, just today, just to take the edge off. The negotiation begins, the familiar dance between the part that wants relief and the part that wants to be free. This internal dialogue is as scripted as any play, with each voice knowing its lines, playing its role in a drama whose ending seems predetermined. What triggers these elaborate performances? The triggers are as unique as fingerprints, yet they follow recognizable patterns. For some, it is the transition between work and home, that liminal space where one identity ends and another must begin. For others, it is the confrontation with success or failure, both equally terrifying in their implications about who we really are. Loneliness is a universal trigger, but so is intimacy when it threatens to expose parts of ourselves we have hidden. Boredom triggers some, overstimulation others. The key is not the specific trigger, but what it represents, what nerve it touches, what sleeping dragon it awakens in the depths of the psyche. Jung understood that these triggers are not arbitrary. They point directly to our core wounds, our fundamental conflicts, our deepest fears. The person triggered by criticism is not simply thin-skinned, but carrying an unbearable sense of shame that criticism threatens to confirm. The one triggered by success may be terrified of visibility, of being seen and found wanting. These triggers are like keys that unlock doors we have spent years trying to keep closed, doors behind which parts of ourselves wait in exile, growing hungrier and more desperate with each passing day. The exhaustion that comes from fighting these patterns through willpower alone is not a sign of weakness, but of the fundamental impossibility of the task. Willpower is a finite resource, depleting with each use like a battery running down. Every decision we make, every temptation we resist, every impulse we suppress draws from this limited reserve. By evening, when we are tired and our defenses are low, the well has run dry. This is why so many people can maintain their resolve through the bright clarity of morning, only to find themselves surrendering in the shadows of night. They are not failing. They are simply running out of fuel for a fight that requires infinite energy. But there is another way, a way that Jung discovered through his deep exploration of the human psyche. Instead of trying to row harder against the current, we can learn to read the water itself. The unconscious is not chaotic, but patterned, not random, but meaningful. It operates according to its own laws, its own rhythms, its own logic. When we stop trying to impose our conscious will upon it, and instead learn to understand its language, we discover that it is not our enemy, but our teacher, not trying to destroy us, but to complete us. The process of naming what we experience is more powerful than most people realize. When you can say, "This is anxiety about tomorrow's presentation," or "This is loneliness from feeling unseen by my partner," or "This is the old shame from childhood returning," something profound happens. The unnamed feeling that seemed overwhelming and infinite becomes finite and workable. It has boundaries, a shape, a beginning and end. The act of naming creates a container for the experience, allowing you to hold it rather than be consumed by it. Language becomes a tool not for controlling the shadow, but for relating to it. As you develop this capacity for recognition and naming, you begin to notice something remarkable. The craving, when truly seen and acknowledged, often transforms into something else entirely. What appeared as a desire for alcohol might reveal itself as a longing for peace. What seemed like hunger for stimulation might be a need for meaning. The addiction has been a misguided attempt to meet a real need, like taking the wrong medicine for an illness. No wonder it never quite worked. No wonder the relief was always temporary. No wonder you always needed more. This is the beginning of integration, the process Jung called individuation. You are not trying to eliminate parts of yourself, but to bring them into consciousness, to give them a place at the table of your psyche. The part that craves numbness is not evil, but wounded. The part that seeks escape is not weak, but overwhelmed. These parts developed for good reasons, usually in response to situations where they were the best option available. A child who learns to dissociate during trauma is not wrong, but brilliantly adaptive. The problem comes when that adaptive strategy continues long after the danger is past, when the protection becomes a prison. Accepting these parts of yourself does not mean indulging them. It means acknowledging their existence, understanding their purpose, and gradually helping them find new ways to meet their needs. This is delicate work, requiring patience and compassion. You cannot rush a wounded part of yourself into healing any more than you can rush a broken bone into mending. There is a natural pace to psychological integration, a rhythm that must be respected. Forcing the process only creates more resistance, more shadow, or fuel for future addictive patterns. The journey requires a fundamental shift in identity. You must stop seeing yourself as the person trying to quit something and begin seeing yourself as someone engaged in a process of becoming whole. This is not about subtraction but addition, not about removing parts of yourself, but about including more of who you are. The energy that has been bound up in maintaining addictive patterns, in fighting against yourself, in hiding from your own truth, begins to become available for other purposes. You start to discover capacities you did not know you had, strength that were hidden beneath the struggle, creativity that was blocked by the constant internal war. Each time you meet a craving with curiosity rather than judgment, each time you name what you are truly feeling, each time you offer compassion to a wounded part of yourself, you are laying down new neural pathways. The brain is remarkably plastic, capable of change at any age. The old highways of habitual response can be replaced by new roads of conscious choice. This does not happen overnight. The old roads remain for a long time, easier and more familiar than the new ones. But with each conscious choice, the new pathways become stronger, more established, until eventually they become the default route. The energy of craving is not your enemy, but your life force misdirected, like a river that has been dammed and diverted until it floods the wrong valleys. Every person struggling with addiction carries within them an enormous reservoir of power, the very same force that drives the compulsion. This energy does not need to be destroyed or suppressed. It needs to be understood and redirected, transformed from a destructive flood into an irrigating stream that brings life rather than devastation. This is the alchemical work that Jung understood so deeply, the transformation of lead into gold, poison into medicine, shadow into light. When the familiar pull begins, when that energy rises in your chest or belly or throat, you stand at a crossroads that most people never recognize. The habitual path leads to the known outcome, the temporary relief followed by the inevitable return of need. But there is another path, one that requires courage and creativity. Instead of trying to make the energy disappear, you can ask yourself what else might satisfy this surge of life force. The person who reaches for a cigarette might step outside and take 10 deep breaths of night air, feeling the same expansion in the lungs, but without the poison. The one who opens the bottle might pour that intensity into writing 1 page of raw, honest truth about what they are feeling. The energy remains, but its expression transforms. This is not about substitution in the simple sense of replacing one habit with another. It is about recognizing that every craving carries information about what you truly need and finding ways to meet that need directly, rather than through the indirect and, ultimately, unsatisfying route of addiction. The executive who cannot stop working might discover that what drives them is not ambition, but a desperate need to feel valuable. Once recognized, this need can be met in countless ways that do not require sacrificing health and relationships on the altar of productivity. A person lost in digital scrolling might find that their real hunger is for stories, for connection, for the sense that they are not alone in their human experience. Books, conversations, creative expression can feed this hunger in ways that social media never will. The process of building new rituals requires the same intentionality that unconsciously went into constructing the addictive patterns. You must become the architect of your own transformation, designing practices that honor both your needs and your values. These new rituals do not have to be grand or complex. Often the simplest practices are the most powerful. When the urge to escape arises, you might have a ritual of placing both hands on your heart and asking, "What do you need?" When anxiety triggers the old pattern, you might have a practice of writing 3 sentences about what you are feeling, no more, no less. When loneliness calls, you might reach out to one person with a genuine message rather than losing yourself in the false connection of addictive behavior. The building of these new patterns happens slowly, incrementally, through thousands of small choices. Each time you choose the new ritual over the old pattern, you are laying down a thread. At first, these threads are fragile, easily broken. The old superhighways of habit are still there, wide and familiar and easy to travel. But with each repetition of the new choice, another thread is laid down. Eventually, these threads begin to form a rope, then a cable, then a bridge strong enough to carry you across the chasm of craving. The old highways do not disappear immediately. They remain for years, sometimes for life, but they become overgrown with disuse, while the new paths become clear and well-traveled. As this transformation deepens, something unexpected happens. You begin to discover that the very sensitivity that made you vulnerable to addiction is also your greatest strength. The person who felt everything so intensely that they needed to numb themselves discovers that this intensity, when channeled consciously, becomes the source of profound creativity, deep empathy, spiritual insight. The one who could not tolerate boredom finds that this intolerance, redirected, becomes a drive for meaning and purpose that transforms not only their own life, but touches the lives of others. The wound becomes the source of the medicine, not just for yourself, but for the world. Your identity begins to shift in ways you could not have anticipated. You are no longer the person struggling with addiction. You are someone who has journeyed into the depths of their own psyche and returned with wisdom. You have faced parts of yourself that most people will spend their entire lives avoiding. You have learned to hold discomfort, to tolerate ambiguity, to sit with intense feeling without being overwhelmed. These are not small accomplishments. They are the marks of someone who has done the deep work of becoming fully human, of integrating the shadow, of accepting the totality of who they are. The trust you develop in yourself through this process is different from confidence or self-esteem. It is deeper, more rooted, based not on never falling, but on knowing you can get back up. You have proven to yourself that you can face your demons and survive, that you can feel the full intensity of craving and choose differently, that you can hold pain without being destroyed by it. This trust becomes a foundation upon which a new life can be built, a life not free from difficulty, but free from the fear of difficulty, not without shadows, but no longer controlled by them. There are moments of grace in this journey that arrive unexpectedly. The day you realize you have not thought about your old pattern for hours, then days. A morning you wake up and feel excitement rather than dread about what lies ahead. The evening you sit with discomfort and find, to your amazement, that it passes like weather through the sky of consciousness. These moments cannot be forced or scheduled. They arise naturally from the deep work you have been doing, like flowers blooming in soil that has been carefully tended. They are signals that transformation is not just possible, but actually happening. The relationship with craving itself transforms. What once felt like an overwhelming force that could destroy you becomes more like a familiar visitor, someone you know well and no longer fear. When it arrives, because it still does arrive, you greet it with something approaching curiosity or even compassion. You recognize it as a part of yourself that is trying to communicate, to protect, to meet needs in the only way it knows how. You can thank it for its concern while gently showing it that you have found better ways to care for yourself. This is not a battle, but a negotiation, not a conquest, but a conversation. Jung knew that the goal was never to become someone without shadows, without difficult emotions, without the capacity for destructive behavior. Such a person would not be whole, but diminished, not enlightened, but simply repressed in more sophisticated ways. The goal is integration, the ability to hold all of who you are without being controlled by any single part. The addiction was never the real problem. It was a symptom of the deeper challenge of becoming whole in a world that encouraged fragmentation, of maintaining connection to yourself in a culture that profits from your disconnection, of honoring your depths in a society that rewards only surfaces. The secret that Jung understood, that the alchemists encoded in their mysterious texts, that every person who is genuinely transformed discovers, is that the very thing you thought would destroy you becomes the source of your strength. The addiction that seemed like a curse becomes the teacher that forced you to look deeper than you ever would have chosen to look. The shadow that terrified you becomes the guardian of your most precious gifts. The wound that would not heal becomes the opening through which grace enters. This is not a consolation prize for suffering, but the fundamental pattern of psychological transformation. Freedom is not the absence of craving, but a new relationship with it. It is not the elimination of the shadow, but the integration of it. It is not becoming someone who never struggles, but someone who has learned to use struggle as a catalyst for growth. The person you become through this process is not who you would have been without addiction. You are deeper, more compassionate, more aware of the complexities of human nature. You have earned a kind of wisdom that cannot be taught, only lived. You have discovered that even in your darkest moments, something in you was seeking light. Even in your most destructive patterns, something in you was trying to heal. This is the ultimate realization, the truth that sets you free, not by eliminating difficulty, but by transforming your relationship to it. You are not broken and in need of fixing. You are whole and in the process of discovering that wholeness. The addiction was not a detour from your path, but part of the path itself, teaching you lessons you could not have learned any other way. Every moment of struggle, every moment of craving, every moment of choosing differently has been sculpting you into someone capable of holding both darkness and light, both weakness and strength, both shadow and self. The journey does not end with the conquering of addiction, but with the integration of all you have learned through wrestling with it. You become someone who can help others, not because you have all the answers, but because you have lived the questions. You know what it is like to be lost in the darkness and to find your way not by eliminating the darkness, but by developing night vision. You know that transformation is possible, not because you read about it, but because you have lived it, cell by cell, choice by choice, moment by moment. And in knowing this, in living this truth, you become a beacon for others still struggling in their own. Shadows showing them not that the journey is easy, but that it is possible, not that they will become perfect, but that they are already whole, waiting to be discovered.